Never before had America witnessed such an unusual gathering.
Yeah, you see those people? Yeah, these were the hippies, the ultimate game changers of their generation. With wild hair, colorful clothes, and a mission to live free, they rejected the old rules, dreaming of peace, love, and unity. And in the summer of '69, nearly 500,000 of them gathered on a muddy field for Woodstock, a 3-day festival that became so much more than music. Woodstock was a revolution, a movement, a wild, chaotic celebration of freedom. What was so powerful about that one concert? It made people gamble everything, money, safety, their future, just to be there. What did they see, feel, or experience that made it all worth it? To get that, let's rewind to the late 1960s. America was a place on fire. Well, not literally, but pretty close. The Vietnam War was raging on, and young people were saying, enough. They were out in the streets, protesting and demanding peace. Civil rights movements were shaking up the status quo, fighting for equality. And across the board, people were feeling this need for change. And right in the middle of all this was a new generation who were totally done with traditional rules and wanted freedom, love, and, you guessed it, rock and roll. Then enters the star Woodstock, but not the festival just yet. You see, it was never meant to be something like this. This whole thing actually started as something totally different. But what difference are we talking about here? Michael Lang, a young concert promoter who had pulled off the Miami Pop Festival the year before, and his buddy Artie Kornfeld had this big dream of creating a recording studio. A super chill, woodsy place in Woodstock, New York. They wanted it to be somewhere artists could jam in peace, surrounded by nature. But they didn't have the cash to make it happen. This is where two New York entrepreneurs, Joel Rosenman and John Roberts, come in. Now these guys were already building a recording studio in New York City. And through a twist of fate, Lang and Kornfeld's lawyer introduced them to Rosenman and Roberts. Lang and Kornfeld pitched their idea, but surprise, the studio in the woods plan didn't exactly blow Roberts and Rosenman away. Instead, they pitched back an idea. Why don't we just throw a concert with all these amazing artists hanging around Woodstock? And just like that, they shook on it, formed Woodstock Ventures, and started piecing together what would become one of the biggest cultural events in history. But you can bet things didn't go off without a hitch. These guys couldn't even agree on how to set it up. Roberts, all about order, was the practical numbers guy, while Lang, ever the free spirit, just wanted good vibes and no rules. Now it's a miracle they even found a place for this thing. Lang tried finding spots but kept striking out, and towns were shutting them down left and right. Finally, it was Roberts and Rosenman who found the golden ticket, a dairy farm in Bethel, New York, owned by a guy named Max Yasgur. He thought this whole festival thing sounded like a blast and agreed to rent his land. Little did he know, that field would soon be swarming with thousands of music-loving, mud-covered hippies. Once the venue was set, it was time to line up the talent. But even though the rock and roll scene was massive, none of the big-name artists wanted to commit. Then they struck gold with a band called Creedence Clearwater Revival. Yes, the guys who sing Fortunate Son. As soon as Creedence signed on, it was like a floodgate opened, and other big acts started jumping in. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Who, The Grateful Dead, and so many more. Just like that, the lineup was stacked with the hottest artists of the time. Now the plan was to sell tickets, which sounds normal and simple, but not as simple as we thought. Except they sold tickets only in New York City record stores and by mail. No online sales, no box offices across the country. And guess what? About 186,000 people bought tickets in advance, But the organizers were only expecting 50,000 people to show up. As the day got closer, they were hearing whispers that way more people were planning to come. By the time they realized just how big this was getting, it was way too late to set up fences and ticket booths. So Woodstock officially became a free concert, simply because they lost control of the crowd. People just rolled in and made themselves at home. And here's where things really get crazy.
Woodstock Nation! You guys have been great. 250,000 strong. You've been great. This is going to be great. Please welcome from York, Pennsylvania, live!
Woodstock was supposed to be just a small, chill music festival. You know, the kind where you could sit back, listen to good tunes, and maybe see a few thousand people at most. But, as we know now, that's not exactly how it played out. Woodstock ended up turning into a monster event, a cultural phenomenon that completely spiraled out of control. And honestly, the people organizing it were just scrambling to keep up. Woodstock was supposed to be a small event, but what happened was that everyone was joining now. It spread like wildfire. Friends and cousins and relatives calling each other to join the game because it's a free league now. So why not? Instead of a few thousand, over 400,000 people showed up. Just imagine trying to plan a cozy backyard BBQ, and suddenly the entire neighborhood and their cousins show up. That's what happened. The organizers were up to their necks in issues: crowd control, not enough bathrooms, not enough food, and of course, no way to keep track of all these people. It was the ultimate oops moment.
I've often tried to oversee the song, the field, the tide, maybe.
Now let's talk about the venue. Originally, they planned to hold Woodstock in the town of Woodstock itself on land owned by a guy named Alexander Tepuz. Perfect? Well, not so fast. Locals freaked out and basically shut that idea down. The festival planners tried another location in Saugerties, New York, but the landowner's attorney quickly squashed that idea too. Yeah, these were the places we talked about earlier, the places that shut them down. By now, things were getting tense, and the organizers were practically sweating bullets. Time was running out, and they were still hunting for a place. Finally, they stumbled upon Max Yasgur's farm. Max's dairy farm was a massive piece of land, a whopping 300 acres, and he was cool with the festival being there. But this venue change happened right before the festival was set to start. So the organizers were in a mad rush to get everything ready, but they barely had time to put up fences, let alone make sure the place was ready for hundreds of thousands of people. It was basically like hosting the biggest party of the decade with only hours to prepare. Oh, and speaking of planning, ticketing was supposed to be a major part of Woodstock's setup. The organizers had intended for Woodstock to be a ticketed event, with entry prices set at $18 in advance or $24 at the gate, which is like paying $150 to $200 today. Sounds reasonable, but remember those 50,000 early birds who showed up way before the festival even began? Yeah, they had other ideas. People just started flooding the site. Before the organizers could even blink, ticket booths became pointless. They hadn't finished putting up fences, so people just walked in like it was their backyard. Overnight, the festival went from being a paid event to a massive free-for-all. And what about security, you ask? Well, with that many people showing up without tickets, there wasn't exactly a strong security perimeter in place. It was one giant open field with people streaming in, like a music-loving tidal wave. They couldn't exactly turn folks away at that point. Woodstock had officially gone rogue. The organizers finally managed to put together a stage, and just in time the music kicked off. They were finally going to have what they wanted. Uh-oh, not so fast, though. Mother Nature had other plans. But as if things weren't chaotic enough, nature decided to throw another curveball. It rained, a lot. The mud turned the place into a swamp, and yet people didn't leave. Instead, they turned it into a muddy, groovy playground. People bonded over the chaos. Some even went skinny, dipping in the nearby pond. Because why not? And despite the insane logistics, the last-minute venue change, and the massive ticketing fiasco, the show went on. It was wild, messy, and totally unplanned. Yet somehow all the chaos and mishaps became part of the magic of Woodstock. The festival might have left its organizers financially wiped out, but Woodstock wasn't a failure. They held on to the film rights, which turned out to be a jackpot. When the Woodstock documentary hit theaters, it became a huge success and immortalized those 3 muddy, music-filled days in 1969. Now we've got hundreds of thousands of people descending upon a tiny rural town in Bethel, New York, turning it into the ultimate no-rules concert experience. Do you really think that it just went away with the rain and chaotic people around? No, there was a huge mess made. Huge. First up, you wouldn't believe the traffic jam that unfolded. The festival's location was in the middle of nowhere, which didn't have nearly enough roads to support this tidal wave of people. People left their cars and started walking miles just to get there. And Bethel? Well, the town saw this and basically said, "Let's not even try to enforce anything. It'll only make it worse." So traffic reports were broadcast on every station, warning people to stay home. But did that stop anyone? Nope. It only seemed to encourage more people to head there. And rain, of course, had to join the chaos. Mud was everywhere. Roads became slip and slides, and people were practically knee-deep in sludge. Not that it stopped the crowd. With no proper toilets, food, or medical facilities, the 400,000-plus Woodstock attendees were left to brave the elements. And they did, like warriors in bell-bottoms. By day 2, things had become so wild that even New York's Governor Rockefeller stepped in. He actually wanted to send 10,000 National Guard troops to keep the peace. But festival organizer John P. Roberts talked him out of it. Instead, a local Air Force base chipped in to help, even airlifting performers to the stage. Imagine Jimi Hendrix being helicoptered in like a rock and roll superhero. And speaking of Jimi Hendrix performed last, Monday morning at dawn, after all the delays. By then, the crowd had dwindled down to around 30,000 from the insane 450,000 peak. But they stayed to see him, and what a show he gave. Hendrix's rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner on electric guitar was pure magic. He and his new band, Gypsy Sun and Rainbows, jammed for over 2 hours, creating a sound that defined the 60s. Given the challenges, it's almost shocking how peaceful it all stayed. Only 3 fatalities were recorded, 2 overdoses, and 1 tragic accident, where a 17-year-old was run over by a tractor while he slept in a field. Sure, there were a few injuries and a fair share of overdoses, but for 400,000 people living in the mud without rules, it was about as peaceful as it could be. Woodstock earned its place as the 3 days of peace and music. Behind all that magic was some serious tech wizardry. Bill Hanley, the sound engineer, had set up a system for 150,000 people, but with more than 500,000 attending, it still worked like a charm. He had speaker columns on 70-foot towers, a setup later dubbed the Woodstock Bins. Then there was Chip Monk, the lighting director, who threw together a lighting setup in record time after the original venue was canceled. Without enough time to create a proper roof, Monk had to improvise, using only spotlights, which turned out to be just the right touch for this raw, almost otherworldly atmosphere. Monk didn't just work the lights, though. He was suddenly tapped as the event's master of ceremonies. His announcements became part of Woodstock's charm, like the memorable warning about the brown acid circulating in the crowd. He wasn't trying to be funny, but it became iconic. And that brown acid? It became the stuff of legend. Now let's talk about those unforgettable performances. Woodstock had a lineup that makes any music lover drool. Santana, relatively unknown back then, stunned the crowd with a legendary set that put him on the map. Janis Joplin gave one of her most intense performances, leaving her heart out on stage. And The Who? They unleashed their rock opera, smashing guitars and cementing their place as legends. Each artist had their moment. Each band played through rain delays, mud, and technical hiccups. But they didn't just play. They created history. And every artist seemed to know that this was more than just a festival. It was the birthplace of a cultural revolution. Some big names like Bob Dylan, Led Zeppelin, and the Rolling Stones were invited but didn't make it. Dylan was nearby but chose not to come, which was kind of ironic since he was a defining figure of the era's counterculture. The Stones were busy with other gigs, and Led Zeppelin wanted to do their own thing. Funny how they all missed what would become the defining concert of the century. Woodstock in 1969 was a part of what was soon called the Woodstock Nation. A massive sea of people, hundreds of thousands, camping out together on muddy fields, practically building a little city of music, peace, and pure vibe in the middle of nowhere. People were everywhere, lying on blankets, leaning against trees, huddled together, sharing stories and sandwiches, probably a few guitars, and let's be honest, maybe a bit more than that. The weather wasn't exactly a friend here. Rain, and I mean pouring rain, turned the grounds into a giant mud pit. People were slipping and sliding, basically mud wrestling their way from one end to the other. Shoes were disappearing in the mud, and raincoats became priceless treasures. But guess what? Instead of grumbling, folks just embraced it. They didn't come all this way to worry about a little rain, right? People danced in the rain and rolled around in the mud. Woodstock became this messy, unforgettable playground. And here's the thing, no one was just getting through it. They were living it. Total strangers sharing food and water, blankets and clothes, even just sharing smiles. You'd have a businessman from New York laughing with a hippie from San Francisco, all under the same muddy sky. Different worlds colliding, people who'd normally never cross paths, suddenly bonded over music, weather, and this unspoken electric spirit of togetherness. Everyone just clicked. The scene was almost surreal. The headlines, though, Who? They were something else. Some newspapers were like, "Oh no, hippies in the mud." The Daily News had headlines like, "Traffic uptight at Hippie Fest," and "Hippies mired in a sea of mud." And the New York Times? They called it a nightmare in the Catskills. They wrote it off as some kind of lemming-like march to chaos. They were convinced Woodstock was this big old disaster where people just got stuck and went a little wild. But then, the truth started to trickle back. Parents were calling the papers, "Hey, my kid's there, and they're telling me it's actually kind of amazing." And the vibe shifted. A New York Times reporter named Barnard Collier was there, and at first got pushed to write a super negative story. He was like, no thanks, and insisted on writing what he actually saw, people being peaceful, kind, and united. And in the end, the world got a glimpse of the real deal. Woodstock wasn't just a concert, it was a statement. This crowd had endured rain, mud, and rough conditions, yet somehow it stayed calm and cooperative. The Times Herald-Record, a local paper, was the only outlet covering the event on the ground. They even had a motorcyclist ferrying stories and photos because the roads were clogged for miles. So Woodstock? It was one giant heartbeat of people who wanted nothing more than to believe in peace, love, and music. And that spirit shined through, even when everyone was up to their knees in mud. The impact of Woodstock was immense, and it basically became the crown jewel of 1960s counterculture. It was 1969, America was tangled in the Vietnam War. Protests were everywhere, and the youth, well, they were fed up. They're tired of the war, tired of rules, and just overall done with being told what to do. Woodstock arrives like a giant exhale, a place to embrace peace, love, and freedom. Sounds dreamy. Woodstock's big cultural statement, peace and anti-war. The whole festival practically screamed, "Make love, not war." Back then, the world was divided over the Vietnam War. People were protesting left and right, and Woodstock's attendees wanted nothing more than an end to the violence. Now, why was this so radical? Because peace wasn't exactly mainstream at the time. Young people were tired of hearing about fighting and nuclear threats. They wanted something more idealistic, something better. By now, it's clear that Woodstock was more than just a music festival. It was the definition of counterculture. Now, what's counterculture? Basically, it's when people go, "You know what? We're going to do things our way." And that's exactly what the hippie movement was about, breaking free from the establishment. These weren't your parents' kind of concerts. Attendees dressed how they wanted, danced how they wanted, and yeah, they embraced a lifestyle that wasn't exactly corporate-friendly. Long hair, wild clothes, and those funky Volkswagen buses. It was all a massive, colorful rebellion. The counterculture movement was also about social justice, which Woodstock embraced to its core. People there weren't just there for music. They believed in equality, in ending racial discrimination, in women's rights, and in freedom for everyone. Woodstock was like a colorful 3-day ad for be yourself and treat others with kindness. It was anti-authority, anti-war, and definitely anti-anything boring. Now here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone thought Woodstock was sunshine and daisies. The media, as usual, had to bring in their opinions. But something shifted. Woodstock's story wasn't one of chaos. It was one of community. Parents of attendees started calling the media, telling them the real story. Their kids were safe, having fun, and actually living out the ideals of peace and love. Slowly, the media started to change its tune. They realized that, while Woodstock wasn't your typical concert experience, it wasn't a disaster either. It was something new, something different, and it was mesmerizing. Now, we can't talk about Woodstock without talking about the music, right? This was the height of rock and roll's influence. Bands weren't just musicians. They were the voices of a generation. Their lyrics were like rallying cries against the establishment. Take the Beatles, for example. "I hope I die before I get old," they sang. It was this mix of freedom, defiance, and sheer creativity that made rock music the backbone of the counterculture. These musicians weren't just performing. They were sharing the spirit of rebellion, peace, and freedom that every single person at Woodstock was there for. And with all those psychedelic vibes and revolutionary songs, Woodstock became a beacon for those who didn't fit the mainstream mold. People bonded over the music, the lyrics, and the shared dream of a world where everyone was free to just be themselves. In the end, Woodstock became a snapshot of an entire movement. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but that's what made it powerful. People came together, thousands of them, for peace, for music, and to show the world that there was another way to live. The media may have judged it, and society may have labeled them, but Woodstock attendees couldn't care less. They knew they were part of something historic, something that people would remember long after the mud dried and the music stopped. So if Woodstock taught us anything, it's this. When people come together for a cause, for an ideal, they can create a moment that lasts forever. The festival may have ended, but its spirit? That's something we're still feeling today. It was wild, it was messy, and it was unforgettable, just like every great revolution should be. But the wild world of Woodstock had a lot of challenges and controversies, where peace and love clashed head-on with some serious logistical nightmares. This wasn't exactly paradise. As the crowd swelled, things went from peace and love to, uh-oh, this might be a disaster. First up, let's talk logistics, or rather, the lack of logistics. Imagine inviting a few friends to a party. and instead thousands of strangers show up with tents, guitars, and endless tie-dye shirts. That's exactly what happened to the Woodstock organizers. They planned for around 50,000 people, but nearly 10 times that showed up, turning the field into a massive human sea of chaos. There were 2 bathrooms for what felt like everyone in New York, and the food? Gone by day 2. I mean, picture it. Thousands of people hungry, tired, and probably a little too sunburned, with nothing to eat but granola and whatever snacks they managed to bring. The organizers tried to airdrop food. Yes, like a literal airdrop, to keep people from fainting. But it wasn't enough. And don't even get me started on the medical facilities, or should I say, lack thereof. If you twisted an ankle dancing or took a little too much peace juice, there was nowhere to go for help. Woodstock was starting to feel more like Survival Fest 1969. And sanitation? Total disaster. With a crowd this size and not enough toilets, nature was calling everywhere. People had to use anything they could find, trees, bushes, corners, turning this peaceful field into something that, well, wasn't so peaceful anymore. And rain? It turned the whole place into a muddy mess. People were slipping, sliding, and splashing around, which made it feel more like a mud wrestling championship than a music festival. Imagine walking around with mud up to your knees and the smell of, well, let's just say, not roses. And then there was the money situation, or should we say, the lack of it. Woodstock was originally supposed to be a paid festival, but when the crowd started pouring in, fences came down, and suddenly it was a free-for-all. Imagine planning the biggest party of the century and then having your ticket booth literally disappear. It's safe to say the organizers were sweating bullets, realizing they were going to take a huge financial hit. Woodstock was actually a complete financial disaster for its organizers. A financial Woodstock of pain. They were left with bills up to their eyeballs, from the cleanup costs of that mud-soaked field to medical expenses for all the people who needed peaceful medical attention. They didn't break even until a miracle happened. The release of the Woodstock documentary, which turned the festival into an international sensation and helped claw back some of that lost cash. But even then, they were barely breaking even. Woodstock became a legend, but for the organizers, it was like signing up for the most stressful, expensive weekend of their lives. You could say they paid for peace and love with a pretty hefty price tag. No matter how much it cost them or what they had to bear, the way Woodstock inspired future festivals is like how that one cool kid in school starts a trend that everyone else copies. Woodstock paved the way for epic festivals like Glastonbury, Coachella, and Lollapalooza. They might have more elaborate stages, fancy setups, and all the high-tech stuff we see today, but the heart of it? The spirit of peace, unity, and freedom? That came straight from Woodstock's playbook. It was Woodstock that set the stage, literally, for how massive music gatherings could become the go-to place for music lovers to just let loose and vibe together. Then, there's this whole cultural symbolism thing. Woodstock isn't just a festival anymore. It's a whole vibe. It's like peace, love, and rock and roll all wrapped up in one big memory. Woodstock became a symbol of a generation that wanted change. Even today, when people talk about the Woodstock generation, they're talking about those folks who believed in peace over war, love over hate, and music as this universal language that could bring everyone together. Woodstock's story didn't just stop in '69. There were attempts to recreate it, like Woodstock '94 and Woodstock '99. Each one tried to bring back that magic, but they didn't all go as planned. While '94 was pretty successful, '99 is famous for, let's just say, not so peaceful vibes. And then there was Woodstock '50, which was supposed to celebrate the festival's big anniversary, but it just couldn't make it to the stage. Seems like some things just can't be repeated no matter how hard you try. Now, even though the original Woodstock site is pretty quiet, it's far from forgotten. The Bethel Woods Center for the Arts, built on the festival's old grounds, keeps the memory alive. Since opening in 2006, it's hosted concerts and events to honor that legendary weekend in '69. There's even a museum that tells the Woodstock story, drawing fans from all over the world who want to connect with that piece of music history. They even listed the site on the National Register of Historic Places in 2017. So yeah, Woodstock's not just a festival, it's a historic landmark now. And Woodstock's impact doesn't stop there. It's a total economic engine. The Bethel Woods Center and its events bring in millions for the local economy, with people flocking to see where it all happened. From jobs to tourism, Woodstock's legacy isn't just in memories, but in making a real difference in the lives of people around Bethel. But what do you think? Could a festival like Woodstock happen again today? And if it did, would it still have the same magic? Who knows? But one thing's for sure, Woodstock's impact on music, culture, and the spirit of unity is something we're still talking about, and probably always will. Share your thoughts in the comment section below, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more. Thanks for watching.